The panelists will give a short talk each, then they will curse each other, they will interrogate each other, and then we'll open it to the public until about 8 o'clock. I'll just say a few things to start with, actually, and try to introduce the three speakers all at once rather than... I'll just say a few things anyway about why we gathered here. Ironically, this is the place we're here every week to teach law. The only reason you were able to book, the BIH was able to book it, is because the law school has a reading week. So usually we are used to listening to hardcore law subjects here, like law contract, law of land law, equity. It's really strange to be here, to be enlightened about Hegel. But it's also been a very... it's been a venue for so many memorable events, this place. I mean, as you know, a lot of political events took place here if you Google it. So it's always lots of activists book it for their own emancipatory politics. So we're in the same tradition now, following in the French tradition. But one thing about France, if you've noticed, this venue is called the Light, and according to Quaker tradition, the light is where we obviously get enlightenment. And apparently, early Quakers would not actually chat to each other or give talks in order to reach enlightenment, but they would sit in silence, and at some point, the Holy Spirit would visit us. Now we're not going to wait for the Holy Spirit, we're going to evoke it in the form of the Hegelian spirit to speak to us. So what we'll do is talk about this famous book, Reading Marx, which, well, what's nice about this book is, in my view, it's become really, the three authors don't deify or even celebrate Marx, but treat him both as a contemporary and, more importantly, as a philosopher. And then they interrogate Marx from their own perspective in Frank Ruda's case, through Plato's cave, in Agon through Hegel. And Agon is boastful enough to say that you're going to correct Marx's version of the theory of labor because Marx's version of the theory of labor was a bit too rough, and Agon himself gives a more subtle version of the theory of labor via Hegel. And then Žižek talks about object-oriented ontology. In
the book, not here.
In the book. You won't do that here?
No.
Okay. What the book seems to promise is some kind of emancipatory politics that enables us to use Frank's metaphor to not only to come out of Plato's cave, but also to know what to do once we've come out of it, to get rid of our chains. And I'll just say a few things about the colleagues who are going to be discussing, starting with Frank Ruda. Okay, so Frank Ruda we met before. Well, was it the actuality of absolute that you were here for? So, yeah. Another Hegelian conference. He's written a lot on the famous book on Hegel's Rabble, where he rethinks Hegel's theory of the state and political theory in terms of the rabble, which had until then been quite neglected in Hegelian writing. Then you've written on a book on Badiou, Idealism Without Idealism, and more recently about freedom, in a fatalistic view of freedom, which us Lacanians are very comfortable with.
I mean deviation. Isn't your title Materialism Without Matter?
No, Idealism Without Idealism. That was correct.
It's true, sorry.
Yeah.
Idealism without idealism. And freedom without freedom. Freedom as necessity. Shall we start with Frank, and then I'll introduce Agon when it's...
as you like.
Agon's, yeah.
Okay. Well, hello. Is this on? Yeah. So, hello and good evening. So I'm going to say actually something about what I did in the book. and why I did it. And the reason why I don't, I mean, it's not simply meant as a repetition, but why I thought it might make sense to elucidate what I was trying to do there is because like a couple of reviews of this book came out, and they all were basically, well, the book overall is quite okay, but the Ruda chapter sucks, right? How could you really believe that the Platonic cave allegory tells us anything about contemporary capitalism? That is so wrong as reading of Marx, kind of as reading of Plato, and super uninformative for anything with regards to emancipation. So usually I don't mind that so much, but I thought maybe I just didn't say it right. So I'm trying again. So what we're all sort of committed to do in the book is kind of what Adorno once called the experimental reading. Adorno once said, you can only read Hegel in an experimental way, right? Because in certain passages or whatsoever, you have to come up with an inventive solution for what Hegel is doing, because it's so internally opaque and sometimes mystified or whatsoever. And what we're trying to do, I think each in a different way, is what, I mean, the term that Slavoj uses is inventive reading, an inventive reading of Marx, which I think is precisely experimenting with and on Marx. Right? So, and the thing that I try to do is to come to terms with the following problem. Namely, a problematic assumption of traditional Marxism. And the problematic assumption of traditional Marxism, and I think the three of us share this, I believe at least, is that there is, at least latently, always already a pre-configured, always already existing subject of historical transformation. Call it as you like. A sujet supposé de l'histoire, if you wish. Right? And this assumption, as powerful as it can be, became kind of problematic when this very subject, supposed to be the subject of history, did not really do what it was supposed to do. Right? So, and I hoped in producing a weird, let's say, short circuit between a very old questioning of emancipation in Plato, namely the cave allegory, and Marx, to raise again the question of what it means to be emancipated and how to conceive of the subjectivity that is doing this very emancipation, that is realizing or practicing a form of liberation. Okay. And it's totally obvious why one can misread this short circuit immediately in a bazillion different ways, actually. So what I want to argue for quickly is why I still think, even though no one seems to agree with me, that this is a kind of instructive experiment. Okay, what does the cave allegory do? It's actually a myth, right? Obviously, it's a myth, but a myth that is supposed to introduce us in the intricacies of emancipation, actually, right? So, and a lot of people in the Marxist tradition believed that one needs a myth to mobilize people for emancipation, right? So it's not totally, let's say, outside of any kind of Marxist thought, right? I mean, think, for example, of, okay, then he had later a shitty reputation because Mussolini was his student, but other people who didn't become fascists also liked him, namely Georges Sorel, right? A crucial reference point for Walter Benjamin, obviously, in the critique of violence, right? And he argued in his book on violence that the only option of emancipation is to use an emancipatory myth. A highly problematic one in Sorel, because it is kind of, in Sorel's understanding, the myth of a final catastrophic battle, right? And I mean, it sounds a bit Schmittian actually when you read it, but nonetheless, I mean, the idea was one needs a myth to mobilize the masses for emancipation, and that was the myth of the proletarian general strike, right? And that was then became kind of the paradigmatic figure later for Walter Benjamin's figure of divine violence, which was supposed to break the reproductive circles, right, of the forms of violence implemented and repeated by the system. Okay. So I thought maybe Plato's myth could also, within the Marxist tradition, tell us something, because Marxists previously, or before, thought that this is the case. So in a sense, what does Plato's, I mean, you all know this allegory, this is why I'm not describing it in details. What kind of situation is Plato describing? Basically, he's describing a situation where the people involved lack cognitive mapping, in Frederick Jameson's terms, right? Why? Because they're constantly, their gaze is restrained, right? They can't move, they're in chains, their gazes, they're fixated, and they're looking at something that they cannot identify as the thing that it is. I mean, they're looking at shadows, but they don't have any idea that the shadows are shadows, which is why they're weirdly, even though they're super oriented, totally disoriented in a certain sense. That's Plato's argument, right? Okay. And Plato's argument is that these kinds of disorientations that are not even realized as disorientations come with ontological implications of their own, or with ontologies of their own. So the cave prisoners believe in certain things to exist, certain things to be real, and so forth, right? So they're not only asphyxiated in a certain way, they're not only oriented and disoriented in a certain way, they only opt without knowing it for a certain ontology, right? And that is all kind of in the cave allegory setting. And behind them, people carry stuff around, commodities, one could say, right? That was my association. Of whom they only know because there is a constant backlightning. And the constant backlightning is a term Michael Heinrich introduced when he described Marx, right? Marx's theory of fetishism. He says fetishism generates everywhere a kind of backlightning, right? There's always a kind of certain tainted light, if you wish. Okay. So, in a sense, to say it in very trivial terms, what Plato is addressing could easily be identified as what later is called ideology critique, in one way or the other, right? You take one thing to be real, but it's not really real, or whatsoever. Like in very standard and traditional interpretation, you get something like this. And so my question was, is that what Peter Sloterdijk once called the world interior space of capital, a gigantic copula, as he described it, not similar to what Plato says about the cave, in a way? I'm not saying, and this is where all the criticism starts, I'm not saying let's not go for the shadows but for the real things, right? This is not an implication of what I already said, and that is not where I'm going, right? That would be a traditional interpretation. We just need to leave the cave and then things are cool. But even in Plato, it's far more complicated, actually. Okay, because Plato, I mean, you know the story. One of them is somehow thrown out of the cave, right? And then it hurts a lot. And then he returns. And then it hurts even more, right? Because the people don't want to listen to him and they don't want to leave the cave and stuff like that. Okay. So in a certain sense, I want to argue it's obvious that there is no life outside the cave, no permanent life outside the cave. And maybe that is instructive for an understanding of how to read Marx, right? Or combine Plato, the cave allegory, with Marx. Well, did Marx, at least for a certain period of time, not only suggest that we can only, if that metaphor, if you wish, works, counter the shadowy realm of capitalism with another shadowy creature, I mean, a specter, right, that haunted Europe. So maybe shadow against shadow is necessary, right? It's not shadow against light immediately. Okay. And of course, there are a number of questions that one could immediately raise putting these two together. Who the hell built the cave? Right? Did someone build it, or is it just natural? Are we always already in the cave? What the hell does it mean to exit the cave? Like you can immediately see like contemporary theories who think about exodus movements and so forth, right? Leaving, returning, take up that thing. And that is supposed to be a figure of emancipation too. Okay. One thing that struck me, though, was that Plato seems to suggest, at least in certain readings, if you believe the German metaphorologist, it's a really weird profession, actually, but anyhow, the German metaphorologist Hans Blumenberg, that the people in the cave are not really human yet. They're kind of pre-human, weirdly, not realizing their human full potential, right? So what is at stake, and there's another trap, actually, immediately, is what it means to be human, right? And because leaving the cave seems to be linked to overcoming a peculiar, whatever, maybe constitutive, maybe not constitutive form of alienation. Of course, immediately everyone thinks humanism and all these kinds of things, right? And that could be problematic if one would say, well, we could just live somewhere else and not inside the cave, and there doesn't have to be a cave, right? But I'm not saying that. I'd just like to be clear. Okay. And if you take a look at Marx's description of the almost myriad processes of naturalization that happen in capitalism, right? The kind of way by means of which capitalism presents itself, that is Marx, as an eternal natural necessity, right? That's capital. That seems to be a very defining feature of the cave, right? The people in the cave think, well, the cave is just like where we are, right? Naturally, that's our natural surrounding, and that's right where we're always going to be. So I thought, bringing all this together, one could raise the question, well, not of Brexit, but of, what would it be? Sexit? Sounds weird, but you get the point, right? The exit of capitalism, right? It's not a cool term, obviously, but exit of capitalism, maybe. So maybe exiting is an interesting question. If the exit is linked to a return, right? I mean, if that is the movement. And somehow maybe this is different from what people talked about when they talked about exodus. And because then, but then one would have maybe a potential figure, schema, whatever you want to call it, of emancipation, liberation, transformation, and so forth. And one should not forget that, for example, Marx in Capital describes, with the very first sentence, the logic of appearance of a society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. He literally says that, right? Because wealth in that society appears in the form of a gigantic collection of commodities. So what it's all about, and the German Marxist, Marxologist, or whatever you want to call him, Michael Heinrich, that I esteem highly, made that point repeatedly, that this means that what Marx depicts is the logic of appearance of a certain regime of production. So it is about appearance, right? I mean, you see another, not only analogy, I think. Okay. But then the question is, and there is a clock, and I didn't take a look when I started, actually. Did you?
Yeah, about
Do we have
10 more minutes, I think.
10?
I think so.
Oh, that's wonderful. Really?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Being honest, I don't know.
Oh. Okay, that's good. So, what I gave you thus far is a list of, let's say, more or less motifs or short circuit concepts that basically culminate for me in what I'm doing there in 3 points that I think resonate with certain things that the other two talk about. I mean, first, how can one, in what way would one describe, and in what way could one make sense of the idea that capitalism, the world interior space of capital, is a cave, A? B, what would exiting mean? And C, in what sense are complications linked to the exit and to the return, right? Because then one would have something that for the Marxist tradition obviously sounds totally obscene, right? But a Platonic Marxist theory of transformation. And my cue I didn't take from for the description of the world interior space of capital as a cave I didn't take from Capital, but from Marx's 43, 44 manuscripts, which are obviously immensely dangerous to touch even, because everyone thinks humanism immediately, right? It's everyone. But anyhow, Marx says there's something quite interesting, which I thought mirrors nicely the Platonic description of the cave prisoners not being, that sounds weird, but not fully realizing their potential, but also not being fully human. Because Marx talks about the following fact, that political economy, that is the economic science that works as a representation for the reproduction of a capitalist system, and that is right now almost literally Marx, identifies or sees in the worker nothing but an animal reduced to its minimum bodily needs. In German it's auf die striktesten Leibesbedürfnisse reduziertes Vieh, cattle. Right. So there is something going on like an animalization of the worker from the perspective of the economic representation of the economic system. Right? And something really weird happens, I think, here, and Marx, in my reading at least, is aware of that, so I'm pushing him to be less humanist. Namely, that the political economy that identifies this animal in the worker thereby doesn't talk about something totally abstract or whatsoever, or in Marx's terms, reduced. Right? It's an act of reduction, but also in the very same act produces the very reality of this reduction. So not only does the political economy see in the worker just an animal, it creates a reality in which the worker is actually the very animal political economy sees in the worker. Right? So it's the feedback loop built in, which is very interesting, because the animal that political economy sees in the worker is a very unnatural animal. Right? It's not like a dog or whatever, but it's an animal created through the gaze, right, through what political economy sees in the entity that it calls the worker. So, very briefly, and right now I'm trying to tie in what I said in the to tie back to what I said in the very beginning, the problem of, let's say, political subjectivity, because the worker, if I understand early Marx's point correctly, is a kind of real abstraction, what people in the Marxist tradition call a real abstraction. It's something whose reality is produced by the very gaze of political economy on the economic reality. It thereby transforms. And that means the worker per se is not revolutionary. Right? It's just a weird representation of political economy. That, weirdly, generates the reality of itself. Right? Like a shadow starting to live, if you wish. Okay. Like 3.5 more minutes maybe, and then that's okay. So that's quite interesting, because then in the worker per se, there does not lie emancipation, right? Or if one translates this Marxian point back into Plato, that would weirdly radicalize Plato into a setting where even the prisoners are weirdly shadows. Right? And Engels said in the Anti-Düring, and he meant something different, but I think that it plays into my cards. He says, from the very moment the bourgeoisie emerged, it was always accompanied by its shadow, the proletariat. I think that's kind of true, right? I mean, if you take the perspective of the Marx. Okay. And of course, why that is can be very trivially understood, because, well, not the worker, but that which makes the worker the labor force, at least from the perspective of political economy. The worker must sell, and what you sell is a commodity. And of course, the commodity is full of theological niceties, right? I mean, that's Marx's whole point. when he talks about commodity fetishism. Though the commodity fetishism pertains even to he or she who the Marxist tradition identified as revolutionary agent. Okay, what to do with all this, right? I mean, what I'm trying to say that there is not yet an always already constituted good, purified, super revolutionary, always already with emancipatory potential subject, right? So the whole question is about the constitution of that kind of, right? I mean, that must follow from this, right? If that makes any sense, what I'm trying to say. It must mean that one is right now talking about the constitution of a liberated or liberating and emancipating subject. Okay. And here, an interesting problem begins, I think. And Martin Heidegger has pointed that out nicely in his reading of the Käferlagerie. Very long reading, like 100 pages. And he just like distinguishes different stages in the Käferlagerie. But like the difference between two stages is particularly interesting for me. And this difference works in the following way, that someone takes the chains off from the prisoners, but they don't want to leave. They just like want to look at the shadows because it's entertaining and fun and they're used to it. And like Tornado Gaze hurt, right? The guy who just came back was complaining all the time and talking nonsense and so forth. So what does one do in such a situation, right? And the first, I mean, so Plato answers that in the myth, but the first one is drawn out, right? I mean, he or she doesn't go out freely. But so you need someone, that seems to be the suggestion, who draws you out of your natural embeddedness in all the natural beliefs and petty fetishisms and all the kinds of things. Right? So you need someone like Slavoj pointed that out in a series of publications before this book and after this book, like a master. Right? I mean, that is precisely the function of someone like a master, structurally, conceptually. But, and that's really my last 2.5 very long sentences. But I thought, because Slavoj elaborated a contemporary function of the master and its emancipatory potential, resonating also in claims that Badiou made, that in a certain sense one needs a political master, and therefore it's instructive to talk about the situation of the analysant and the analyst in psychoanalysis and so forth. And then he made it just like interesting, nice comment in the Lacan book you just still had on the table, where he basically says, well, the analysant, it makes only sense, and analysis only works if the analysant is a volunteer. Right? If he or she is voluntarily in analysis, because otherwise it won't work. And so I had the idea, if one wants to map this analytical situation on the Käferlagerie situation, which is supposed to say something about exiting capitalism, right? I mean, that is right now the whatever conundrum, let's call it like that. One would have to say something about a dialectics not of master and slave, lord and bondsman, but of master and volunteer in one way or the other, right? Which immediately becomes insanely complicated. Just think, and that's a contemporary resonance, how much capitalism relies on voluntary and volunteering labor. Right? A lot of unpaid labor is voluntary, right? In one way. So one has to distinguish between volunteering and volunteering. And with that, I stop.
Wow, thank you. That ties in nicely with your book on freedom, actually, the concept. So we have to work out how much voluntarism ties in with the freedom as you depicted. Whilst we're pondering what Frank was saying, I'll say a few words about Agon, and then Agon will give Agon I've known virtually for about 5 years, actually, through social media. And thanks to Mrs. May's hostile environment, and she's trying to distance herself from it, but she's definitely responsible. She was the Home Secretary. He was not allowed in this country again and again and again. I don't know how they let you in, so it's a big, it's a big thanks to Lou Miller, actually, and the BIH for finally making it to England, because there's so many attempts to come. Yeah, and I think when I first met you virtually, you were writing the book with Žižek on Kosovo, From Myth to Symptom. Since then, I actually gave up social media to avoid having to see how much he was producing all the time. It was so annoying. Every time you opened Facebook, you had a new book out, including this one, Repeating Žižek. He wrote a book with Frank on Žižek and dialectical materialism, where they try to systematize Žižek's earth. We'll see whether that's an impossibility later. And the other thing, in his spare time, he's done his PhD on Althusser and has 2 books out on Althusser. One on Althusser and Pasolini's film. When you've read the book, neither Althusser nor Pasolini's films will you'll be able to read or watch them the same way again. And another book that has just come out on Althusser and theology. And all the time, again with Frank Ruda, he was founding member and co-editor of Crisis and Critique, which is one of the most influential contemporary philosophy journals online, and it's free. So no capitalist. Well, it hurts to read. You have to pay. But with that, we'll listen to your talk, which will be on what you did in the book.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for organizing this. Well, in this presentation, I will try to draw some possible conclusions from the chapter in the book which we're discussing today, while remaining as thorough as possible, if I can, to what is in there, actually. The traditional understanding of Marxist Hegelian roots bears on 2 fronts. On the one hand, the political theory of the proletariat, and on the other, the logic of capital. The first case is usually associated with Marx's early works and inverting Hegelian dialectics, whereas the second concerns his mature work, where he famously extracts of the rational kernel out of its mystical shell. Politically, Marxist Hegelianism would be recognizable in the way the universal and particular are bound together in his understanding of the proletariat. Is there a necessary link between the general direction and organization of society and the existence of a particular subset of this same society? The Hegelian theory of the concrete universal, of something which stands for the whole within the whole, even more so than the abstract apprehension of its totality, was fully deployed in Hegel's work, both in his understanding of Christianity as well as in his ontology. Even though Marx's theory of class would get increasingly complex throughout his investigations, the idea that one can orient social change by a compass that is guided by a particular social class has direct links with the Hegelian theory of negativity and concrete universality. These are links that Marx would never let go. Marx's Hegelianism is also very much at stake in his mature critique of political economy, especially as it is presented in Capital. In his early work, if his early work was based on a critique of Hegel's idealism, prompting the need to invert the logical grounding from the immaterial real realm of the law to the material problem of survival and work, when it came to the logic of capitalism itself, the stakes could no longer be conceived in this way. For the logic of value, albeit not reducible to that of the property, was equally removed from the material. If Marx's early work on economy was primarily concerned with explaining alienation, the production of disparities by intervention of unjust property rules, in Capital the problem is quite distinct. Here the enigma, the form of value, is rather that of equivalence. How can different objects be equated on the market? And how can profit be produced while keeping to this rule of equivalence? This is where Hegel's science of logic became an important aid, because it was not a matter of showing that below the equal treatment of judicial subject by laws, there was an unequal treatment of economic subject. Instead, it was the matter of showing that the generalization of a real form of equality, with no exception, produced out of its own functioning. But does this have political implications, and if yes, what would they be? Here the question is not so much of interpreting Marx as much as it is a matter of locating the question. Where does one stage the autonomy of Marxist politics? This is in fact a class issue, not in the sense of what one says about class, but where from one speaks about politics. A division like one proposed by Louis Althusser, dividing the humanist from the scientific phases in his work, is certainly useful, but none of these proposals substitute the historical decisions which confronted Marx throughout his life. The first event, when in 1842 he found himself in an embarrassing position of having to discuss what is known as material interest regarding the case of forest thefts and the division of landed property. Secondly, the failure of 1948 of the so-called Springtimes of the People and the subsequent proclamation of Louis Bonaparte as emperor. The 1857 financial crisis, arguably the first worldwide economic crisis, with its social and political effects in Britain, and lastly, the emergence of the Paris Commune in 1871. Each of these events brought about important changes to Marxist thinking. The young Hegelianism of his student years were shattered in 1842 by the intrusion of the problem of survival, of man's need to produce their own means of subsistence, a question which oriented Marx's early critique of private property and his take on man's universality as a concrete consequence of our transformative relation to nature in general and our own nature in particular. A whole view of work, humanity, and the future of the poor was constructed upon his first critique of private property. But Marxist writings on the limit of right and the state were later confronted by the failure of 1848 revolutions, and especially by the emergence of a new emperor through the very democratic means supposed to bring the working class's interests into the direct conflict with those of the bourgeoisie. The critique of political economy acquired a new place in the following years of Marxist studies. Rather than focusing on the relation between civil society and the state, we see a shift towards the infrastructure of civil society itself, in the problem of value and the commodity production. This is the time of Marx's deepening critical studies of the classical economists, leading him to a first presentation of the theory of surplus value and the renewal of his political theory. But nothing in the works of classical bourgeois economists could have anticipated the paradoxical fact that a crisis in the very economic structure responsible for the exploitation and inequality could serve to reinforce rather than destroy its functioning. This was, however, what in 1857 economic crisis brought to view. In order to respond to it, Marx had to devise a new entry point into his critique of political economy, one in which the limits of capital function as internal rather than external ones, a shift with deep consequences for the understanding of value, production, international relations, and the role of the state. It was surely this view on the global dimension of capitalism which made Marx at first responsive to the outbreaks of the communes in 1871, since these confronted the global panorama of Marx's work with local political resistance. But if Marx was surely not going to drop his analysis of the globalized economic network of capitalism, the new sequence of political struggles in the 70s did nonetheless pose the question of timeliness of capitalist development. Was industrialization truly a necessary step in the passage from communal properties of feudal life to a post-capitalist egalitarian society? In these years, even though Marx was not to publish any other works, he furthered his understanding of non-capitalist social formations, a study emblematic, exemplified by his correspondence with the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in 1881. Each of these different sequences in Marxist thought brought about important changes in his conceptual framework. How many minutes have?
21.
21, okay. At early stages of his work, Marx linked the critique of capitalism to the critique of religion in a double sense. First of all, following Feuerbach, the critique of religion meant the undoing of mystifications which naturalized social relations of domination, that is, which made the inverted world brought about by capitalist property relation consonant with our consciousness. But it against But against Feuerbach, it took a critical outlook of social relations in capitalism, showing how these same relations produce and reproduce these mystifications in the first place. It is in this second aspect of irreligious criticism which structures the series of displacements with which Marx understands the so-called research program of 1842-1851. If Feuerbach came to Marx's aid in order to undo the other world of truth, it is the ensuing criticism of Earth which truly characterizes Marx's own thinking. But the way Marx approaches the problem of self-estrangement in its unholy forms appear as an extension of, rather than as a break with the critique of religion. So when one shifts the criticism of religion into criticism of law and property relations, the basis for the worker's alienation from his productions, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of political representation, the basis for the worker's invisibility as an orienting force of society, these displacements still take the form or model of the original Feuerbachian critique of self-estrangement. That is, they still take the form of denouncing of the way abstract relations in fact stand for concrete non-relations. Property rights ensure the worker's exploitation, political representation ensures his political impotence. The movement from abstract to concrete, from the ideal to the real, from the divine to the human, was the principal dynamic of Marxian model of critique, while its objects were the criticism of law and criticism of politics. In sum, while it focused on the relation between labor and property, or civil society and the state. However, when we juxtapose the way religion functions as a negative of critique in his theoretical sequence to the way it reemerges in Marx's most well-known work, and more specifically the most well-known chapter of that work, the section of fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof, from the first volume of Capital, a crucial shift seems to have taken place. Here, Marx is no longer discussing how the products of labor appear as an alien power, acquiring an essential difference from the producers, or proprietary difference. Instead, he is interested in how the products of labor become equivalent to each other, and ultimately to the producers themselves, the equivalence between commodities. The problem Marx is trying to render legible is a central one. If we take the standpoint of what is concretely taking place at the production process, if we enter a factory and see what we find there, nowhere are the social relations which truly condition the process visible. We don't find inequality anywhere, no social relations appear, but rather equally self-serving individuals putting their private properties to use, be this one's own labor force or previously bought means of production, such as machines, etc. But from the standpoint of property, we cannot even find the reason why the capitalist would prefer to invest his money into other property, laborers, rent, machinery, etc., if the end product would be worth the sum of the money he spent. So the very reason of being of the factory is not visible, and so is not the reason why this process begets more money than the money invested in it. It is only from the standpoint of exchange of products, that is, from the products of labor taken as commodities, that the social relations at stake in the very production process become themselves legible. It is only by considering labor as a commodity that the social relations between workers, their distinction from those who buy the labor commodity, the production of surplus value, etc., are expressed. In other words, if we take the standpoint of relation between people, between concrete individuals, social relations are effectively invisible, substituted by property relations which are immediate and equal, and therefore explain nothing of the production process itself. While, if we take the standpoint of relation between things, between commodities, the social relations between people are suddenly expressed at the cost of making concrete individuals invisible. Marx must explain, therefore, the logic of process through which social relations acquire qualities that are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. He turns to physics here, proposing an analogy with light. We see things lit because light hits our eyes, but even though the being of the thing seen depends on the relation between the eye and the thing, that is, of light hitting the thing and then our eyes. We confront these things as separate from us, not as subjective excitations of our optic nerve, but as an objective form of something outside the eye itself. The analogy is therefore, social relations appear as social things outside the subject of this relation, just as the relation between the eye and what is seen appears as an objective thing outside the eye. But at this point, Marx points out the limit of the analogy. In the case of the eye, there is a physical relation between physical things, that is, the eye, the thing being seen, and the light hitting both the eye and the object are materially homogeneous. All the elements in this process are physical. But is it different with commodities? Why? Because the relation at stake here, I'm quoting, is heterogeneous to the things it relates. The existence of the things for commodity has absolutely no connection with their physical properties. The end of quote. In the case of light, we can deduce properties about light by analyzing the object it relates to. Because light interacts with objects being part of the same material world as they are, at a truly infinitesimal level, it can be seen that it exerts force over the object it hits or produces, just heat or excites the optic nerve. On the other hand, the exchange relation between commodities do not contain an atom of use value. That is, they are indifferent to the concrete and material substratum of the things being related. Nothing about value can be deduced by looking at what is concretely put into relations through the value relations. However, it is only from the standpoint of these relations that the social relation between concrete people and things become visible. So while there is a definite social relation between man, this relation assumes for them the fantastic form of relation between things. The term that is not captured by the physical metaphor is fantastic. It implies that information is lost when we only accept the existence of material and concrete things and people. It is not a mere perceptible distortion, like a transcendental illusion which structures our visual field, but concretely plays no part in the behavior of light in sight. The fantastic aspect of this process concerns the fact that if we try to move from the distortion back to the concrete process, we also lose the causal enchainment which truly structures these concrete components. At this point, Marx makes a novel use of religion, clearly distinct from the critical model based on Feuerbach. How many minutes do I have left?
7.
Oh, okay. And I'm quoting Marx. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion. There are products of human brain. The products of human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. So it is in the world of commodities, with the products of man's hands. I call this fetishism, which attaches itself to the products of labor as soon as they are produced as commodities, and is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. The end of quote. The mist-enveloped regions of religion are called upon here not as a model of what is to be criticized, but rather as a model of how social relations truly function in capitalism, as a fantastic domain which effectively transcends us, to the point that without assuming the existence of this transcendental or supernatural standpoint, the legibility of concrete and localized social relations themselves is compromised. Considering how central the critique of religion was to the constitution of Marx's own critical stance, it is worth pondering over the fact that Marx here claims that in order to account for the reality of value form, we must have recourse to religion. What exactly is the status of this necessity? There seems to be a strange enlargement of the scope of materialism in the passage from Feuerbach to early Marx, and then to the standpoint of capital. At first, Feuerbach proposed that the materialist position would recognize that the religious form operates as illusory alienation, to which our own production appears to us as an autonomous or otherworldly, which is why the spiritual overcoming of this illusion would reveal that the human species itself is the source and the site of our self-transcendence. Marx then claimed that this relation of alienation is not an illusion, but rather a redoubling of a very real form of social alienation through which workers are materially deprived of the products of their labor. Alienation is not the essential religious phenomenon, for it is conditioned by the social reality of alienation. The essential dimension of religious world rather be the illusory separation that this alienated sphere then acquires in regards to real social life. Finally, with a shift from property relations to the problematic of value, this separation itself is recognized as part of the social world, since the logic of value is materially separated from its own material substratum. What is then proper of religion as a form? It is true that in Capital, Marx frequently refers to capitalism or aspects of it is religious-like. For example, in the third volume he writes, I quote, "It is a great merit of classical economists to have dissolved the false appearance and deception, this autonomization and ossification of the different social elements of wealth vis-à-vis one another, this personification of things and reification of the relations of production, this religion of everyday life." The end of quote. But to say that the way social wealth is falsely hidden from us in capitalism under the illusory personification of things and conversion of production relation into entities, make it the religion of everyday life, is not to criticize religion, but rather to criticize capitalism in its religion-like features. It is hard to miss that an inversion has taken place here. It is not religion that is being attacked for aiding the reproduction of Wales' social structures. It is rather this social structure which is being represented as religion. And so, once again, religion appears not as an object of critique, but as a model of the world. Walter Benjamin has this capitalism is a religion, but I don't have time to discuss this now because I'm almost at the end. Okay, so to conclude, Marx's famous response to Proudhon's philosophy of poverty was the return the message in its inverted form, the poverty of philosophy. Today, when the value of thinking has become itself measured by the standards of incessant activity and production which organizes all forms of labor, the time may have come to supplement Marx's own position. The crisis of the left is no longer the crisis of idealism, of poor philosophy, disconnected from the material basis which condition it. Ours is poverty of philosophy, a blatant absence of any form of thinking subtracted from the imperative of compulsive activity. A return to philosophy then has a double role today. It is a means to reinvent the critical powers needed in order to transform the world, and it is itself the first movement of construction of something which has no place in our world. Our task, therefore, is not that of fighting the dominance in the current historical structured whole, the dominance which makes itself responsible for what we have lost, say, what is happening all over the world with riots, uprisings, and all the rest. For the contingencies that never became part of the actual whole, in making itself responsible for the phantasmatic status of true communism. This instance also makes itself an indispensable part of our identity as democratic socialism, militants betrayed by the course of the socialist experiments of the 20th century, alleviating our guilt and failures. Our first task is rather to let go of the identity sustained by the loss itself, to lose the loss, which means both to let it go and to recuperate it as being constitutively a ghost, as something that is, to quote Lacan, neither being nor non-being, but the unrealized. In other words, our task is to operate a withdrawal, which itself constitutes the opening for a new field of experimentation of what Marx used to call possible communism. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. More faith in philosophy to, let's say, a route to emancipation. This time to losing the loss. Yeah, no, now our last speaker is Žižek and Slavoj Žižek. You have introduced him before, so I'm sure you all know him. I think I'll just say one thing actually, because I don't know if anyone has ever. Yeah, you all know enough about Žižek. I don't have to go. And also Esther introduced him yesterday, so I don't have to. But there's one story that keeps coming to mind. You know, when I was looking at both your work and Frank Ruda's and Agon Hamza's sort of because several edited collections where you try to systematize a Žižekian school of thought, and then the recent book is about dialectical materialism, but other edited collections are trying to, and that sort of made me wonder whether it's actually a task that is possible. And the metaphor that I keep coming back to is this beautiful short story, but I'm sure you all know it, by Jorge Luis Borges. And I don't know if anyone has compared your work to this guy before, but I don't know why they haven't, because to me it seems so clear that you are that character from the Jorge Luis Borges. And I'm thinking of the story, The Garden of Forking Paths. You know that character Tsui Pen, who gives up the governorship of a big province in China, and he announces to his family that he's giving it up because he has two important tasks to complete, and one is to write a novel in which he says all men will be lost, and the second task is to create a labyrinth, which again would be the most intricate labyrinth ever produced. Anyway, unfortunately, Tsui Pen, this is not prediction, is murdered before he finishes either the labyrinth or the novel, and his children and grandchildren, when they look for the novel, they just find this masses of manuscripts that they can't make head or tails, or they can't put together. It doesn't make any sense. They don't connect together. And then this sinologist comes along. It gets better, I promise. This sinologist comes along and solves the riddle of what was Tsui Pen's task. I mean, he's basically, he solves the riddle that Tsui Pen was not writing a novel and constructing a labyrinth, but the novel was the labyrinth. So it was one and the same task. And the labyrinth he created was one which is a really noble, and if only we could all emulate, actually, project. And what Tsui Pen was doing, and I think in some respects you resemble him, is that every time in his writing of the novel he would come across a contingency or various options, various choices that he would have to make. Instead of choosing one and eliminating all the others and just sticking to one path, he would choose all of them simultaneously. And they would all, that's why you end up with this garden of forking paths. And obviously the paths would proliferate and proliferate because all possible eventualities would be constantly pursued. And despite the fact that Žižek comes back to three, favorites, Lacan, Hegel, and Marx, I think he also, at the time, does us the favor of going on to forking paths. So something happens in the world, he stops to write about that. Something happens somewhere else, he do that as well. So there is this, he's leaving us with a labyrinth that we are still trying to find our way around. So good luck to Frank and Agon, but are looking for their way around. But I think, so Tsui Pen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I like very much this mention of Borges. You know why I like critically to mention Borges? Because I notice this hypocrisy of most of the leftists, how, today, in today's politically correct paranoia, you mention something, there is racism there, anti-feminism, and so on. So with some authors, we have this hyper-sensitive reading. With other authors, who were obviously politically reactionary, somehow because they are ours, they are pardoned in advance. Like my example is Wagner, Nietzsche. Wagner is hyper-analyzed. If in Parsifal he mentions the smell of the nice smell of the dancing girls, it's the reference to how Jews smell, it's anti-Semitism and so on. While with Nietzsche, in his openly reactionary attitude, everything is pardoned in advance. And with the same, I remember, now unfortunately he died, Ernesto Laclau, he was once referring to Borges and said that he was at one of Borges' conferences towards the end, where Borges was already half blind, so that before, it was like this one in a university aula, with a room, with a desk, and Borges asked somebody, do you see well? Yes. Look around if there is a black person in here. I don't speak to blacks, they're too stupid, so please have that one thrown out. Now, what I like is that Ernesto and everyone accepted this as a joke. Ha ha ha, Borges, a good joke. Imagine somebody else saying this, I noticed this, it's very interesting. It's the same with writers. Like, you remember, I don't like Edward Said, but when he wrote an analysis of Jane Austen, where he drew attention to the simple fact of the mentioned in oblique way but unambiguously, the colonial background. Oh, Jane Austen, the greatest, how can you even mention that, and so on and so on. But okay, I want to do now, I hope I will be able to be a little bit shorter, then both of you, so sorry, something very problematic. In the book, I cheat more than both of you, in the sense that it's reading Marx, I don't read Marx. I really criticize object-oriented ontology with the excuse that this is how Marx, if he were to be alive, would have read them. Now I want to do something which fits the title. Reading Marx through Me Too. What would Marx have thought about certain proposals of Me Too? Not so much Me Too as this political correctness and so on. And I want precisely to focus on one thing which was already mentioned by you, this idea of equal contract and so on. How Marx demystifies it, and then how in some parts towards which I'm critical of today's feminism, how precisely as a way to fight coercion and violence in sexual relations, the idea of contract is forcefully returned here and there. For example, in the United States, I was there 2 weeks ago, I was told in some of the states, they already circulate the contract forms, you know. We want to jump to bed AA. You have to fill both names, date of birth, do you have age or whatever, illnesses, then religion, nationality, if this is a problem, and very interesting at the end, what is off limits? Like you must put there, sorry, no anal contact or whatever. And then both sign it, now we are free. And this is not a joke. In Australia, I learned, in my classes in New York, where a guy from Australia claimed that I'm lying, and next day he came and apologized to me and said, no, I checked it up, you are right. In Australia, it's already in 2 of their states, New South Wales and Tasmania. It's a law that a couple, 2 people, before they do it, I don't know how they even think of checking this or whatever, they have to face each other face to face, eye to eye, and both of them should say loudly and clearly, yes, I want to do it. Sorry, I find this nonsensical for no other reason that you can see here the secret ideological bias of all this idea. It secretly takes as a model of sexual contact one-night stands, you know, because there it has a certain meaning, this. I mean, doing this with your wife for years, like every evening, you can do it. But so again, this strange push towards a kind of a bureaucratic registration. We cannot just do it, and especially with this verbal agreement, I even don't see what's the point, because, okay, I will be brutal, I will never be able to do it. But let's say I am violent towards a lady, then she denounces me for raping her, then I say no, but don't you remember you said yes? And of course I am lying, but you know, then you go a step further. You can, it's okay, but nonetheless, I want to do something else here. To problematize generally this idea that sexual contract, we both sign egalitarian contract, we agree, helps. What gets lost in the idea that sexual contract can work as a possible means of guaranteeing that the relationship is voluntary, that is to say without coercion, is, I think, Marx's good old insight from Capital into how a formally free contract can also really be rely on coercion and thus effectively function as a form of coercion. Who can forget Marx's description of the free contract between a capitalist and a worker? This contract is, I quote Marx, in fact, the very Eden of the innate rights of men. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and bantam. End of quote. Both participants are constrained only by their own free will. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the forum in which they give legal expression to their common will. However, the moment the contract is concluded, this beautiful poetic quote from Marx, we can perceive a change in the physiognomy of our dramatis personae. He who before was the money owner now strides in front as capitalist, the possessor of labor power follows as his laborer. The one with an air of importance, smirking, intent on business, the other timid and holding back, like one who is bringing his own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a hiding. End of quote. From Marx Capital. The synonym of hiding, the synonyms of hiding, battering, thrashing, pounding, spanking, thwacking, all evoke also a brutal sexual act. This is me, not much. Does this indicate that we can apply Marxist analysis of a free contract also to the idea of a sexual contract? At the most elementary level, it is easy to demonstrate how, in sexual exchange also, the form of free contract can conceal coercion and violence. One of the agents agrees to sexual contract out of fear, out of emotional blackmail, out of material dependency, and so on. But the complication reaches much deeper and is immanent. In sexual exchange, where freedom, equality, property, and not bantam but enjoyment rule, this additional term, like bantam in Marx, spoils the freedom, equality designated by the preceding terms. Enjoyment introduces asymmetry, surplus, envy, into the balance of the exchange of pleasures. The two or more, I don't want to be caught into binary logic, or more sexual partners reach a deal of what I do to you and you do to me in an interaction that would bring to both of us maximal pleasure. However, how are our pleasures mediated? When I engage in sex with a partner, I may only find pleasure in the other's displeasure and humiliation, or vice versa. I may enjoy in my serving the other, and only find pleasure in the signs of others' ecstatic pleasure. I may do it out of envy, to prove I can better satisfy my partner than his or her previous partners. Plus, I may do it out of love. Sexual pleasure is for me a sign of love, while my partner is interested in me only as the purveyor of sexual pleasure. Can we imagine a starker asymmetry? We should reach even a step further here. In labor capital exchange, worker doesn't sell his product but his own labor power as a commodity. We are dealing here with the logic of universality and its exception. The commodity form gets universal only when, on the market, producers are not only exchanging their products, that is to say, it becomes universal commodity form only when an exceptional commodity appears on the market, which is productive labor force itself. Do we get a homologous exception also in sexual contract? What if the symmetry of each partner giving pleasure to the other is also always already broken? One person works on the other to give it him her pleasure, and the idea is, of course, that this activity of giving pleasure becomes in itself a source of pleasure for the worker. Here enters the homology between surplus value produced by the worker and surplus enjoyment produced by the activity of giving pleasure. The enjoyment generated by the very activity of serving the other, sexual partner. And I think that it's absolute illusion, psychologically, to say I only care for my pleasure when I do things to you or you do things to me. It's always a surplus here. That is to say, the very activity of experiencing pleasure is mediated through your pleasure, like there are, I'm sorry to be a little bit obscenely open, but that's my problem. I can enjoy only if I see signs of pleasure in my partner. If I don't see that, I become impotent, I cannot do it. And I'm not boasting. This can be very unpleasant. I love my wife because her answer in such situation to me is, stop about love and caring me. Can't you just brutally ask me? I want to be an object, not your stupid subject or whatever. And she is right, but let's go on. What makes contractual sex problematic is not only its legal form, but also its hidden bias. Contractual form obviously privileges casual sex, where partners don't yet know each other and want to avoid misunderstandings about their one-night stand. One needs to extend our attention also to the long-term relationship permitted with forms of violence and domination, in much more subtle forms than the spectacular Weinstein-style enforced sex. To paraphrase Brecht, what is the fate of a movie star who was once blackmailed into sex or directly raped to ensure her career, compared with the miserable housewife who is for long years constantly terrorized and humiliated by her husband? But is marriage also not a contract, a permanent one? Kant, who in his Metaphysics of Mors, infamously defined sexual intercourse as the reciprocal use that one human being makes of the sexual organs and capacities of another, end of quote, determines marriage as the contract regulating this use. He dismisses a short-term sexual contract as he calls it pactum fornicationis, contract for fornication, admitting only marriage since in it my partner is not reduced to an object. Or, so consequently, as Jean-Claude Milner pointed out here at Birkbeck a year ago, for Kant, sex outside marriage is quite literally a crime against humanity. In it, both participants reduce each other to objects used for pleasure and thereby deny their human dignity. I mean, I love this idea. Maybe in Hague they should organize another tribunal for crimes against humanity, and it's not about perversion, torture, but you just get a casual sex, crime against humanity, and so on. Okay, now the more problematic part. Further complications emerge here. While parts of Me Too advocate sexual contract, the ideology that underlines, unfortunately, much of Me Too took the Marxist lesson of the hidden asymmetry that sustains the notion of the contract of equal free partners and relying on Marx's notion of the imbalance in the contract between worker and capitalist, where the two are formally equal. Jean-Claude Milner, I resume him here, recently outlined the difference between objective and structural weakness. Weakness as opposite to power. The idea being that this is the big obsession of Me Too, how it's really about power. I mean, as I always repeat, Me Too is the best example of Oscar Wilde's famous saying that everything in life is about sex, except sex itself. Sex is about power, of course. No? So, even if in the labor contract the worker is paid its full value, the exchange between worker and capitalist is not equal. There is exploitation, since worker is a commodity which produces surplus value, more value than its own value. In this sense, the contract is unjust. Worker is in a weaker structural position, even if it is objectively stronger, with more empirical social power and so on and so on. And again, according to Milner, the Me Too movement implicitly transposes the same logic to the sexual exchange between a man and a woman, even if they both formally agree to make love as equal partners. That is to say, even if the appearance is that of an equal exchange of sexual favors, there is a structural equality and the woman, a structural inequality, and the woman is in a weaker position. As with the contract between worker and capitalist, one should emphasize the structural, formal character of this weakness, even if the woman initiated sexual exchange, even if she is socially or financially much stronger, she is structurally weaker. Therein resides the lesson of Harvey Weinstein's scandal. If by rape we understand an enforced sexual exchange, then every heterosexual act is ultimately, at least virtually, potentially, a case of rape. It goes by itself that very few of actual Me Too members are ready to spell out this radical implication. But there were, incidentally, some feminists decades ago when I was young, like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, who claimed that already biologically, physiologically, standard heterosexual act is a violation of the integrity of woman's body, penetration, and so on. The large majority is not ready to claim that sexual act is as such an act of masculine violence. And they proclaim as their goal only to struggle for sexuality which does not rely on male position of power and brings true joy to both partners. However, the implication that sexual act is ultimately as such an act of rape, of violent imposition and coercion, clearly functions as the unspoken presupposition of a great part of Me Too movement, with its focus on the cases of male coercion of violence. Its partisans treat men exclusively as potential rapists and women as potential victims of male power. Milner further deploys how Donald Trump is the exact opposite of Me Too. If Me Too privileges structural weakness at the expense of objective weakness, Trump ignores structural weakness and focuses exclusively on objective weakness and power. For him, politics is basically a immoral game of power in which all participants can be and should be ignored or turned against themselves when circumstances, that is to say, the America First interests demand it. One demonizes Kim Jong-un as a threat to humanity, then one treats him as a friend, and so on and so on, up to the ultimate example of separating children of the illegal immigrants from their parents. In Trump's immoral universe, it is totally logical to attack the weak opponent, the weakest opponent, the opponent as at its weakest point, children. As Mireille concluded, Trump is the Weinstein of the United States politics. However, this asymmetry also signals the fateful limitation and even ethically problematic implication, I think, of this Me Too orientation. Its exclusive focus on structural weakness. And incidentally, I'm not dreaming here. I experienced it a lot like now. 2 weeks ago when I was in New York, I did something totally acceptable, none of my usual bad taste jokes, and a woman attacked me. And patiently, okay, why not? Patiently, I demonstrated that her data are false and so on and so on. And I was quite shocked because her answer to me was, I'm getting lost in empiry. I don't get it that as a woman, she speaks from a weaker position, so she is the victim. That is to say, if nothing else, the position is because of the structural weakness of one sex. I am not presumed innocent until proven guilty. I am presumed guilty until proven innocent. The a priori judgment, more a priori I'm guilty, empirically I should prove that I am innocent. So I am more or less automatically suspected, at least of acting as a white homophobic supremacist, and I am at least guilty of racial and sexual insensitivity. So the position of structural weakness gives a woman the power, and my structural position of a white male effectively makes me powerless, often in practice. This is one wonderful example. Beckett, in his masterpieces, like a short play, his late short play Catastrophe, was wonderfully sensitive to this point, how weakness itself, being a victim, can be used to a multitude of levels, can be used as an extremely efficient instrument of power. And my latest example, I know I was widely criticized for it, is in the United States, this so-called, here, so that people don't accuse me that I'm anti-feminist sexist, here sex relation goes the opposite direction. In that well-known scandal between Avital Ronell and her postdoctoral student Nimrod and so on. Although she ruined her life, she is now half crazy. She escaped to a small Mexican village and so on and wants to stay there. Nonetheless, you should just see her. She is totally broken. Her career is ruined. Nonetheless, she is the master, he is the victim. Now, we thus enter a cruel world of brutal power games masked as the noble struggle of the victims against oppression. One should recall here again that Oscar Wilde saying everything is about power except about sex except sex. Some partisans of Me Too talk about sex, but their position of enunciation is that of power, and of those who don't have it, of course. Following Oscar Wilde, they reduce sex to a power game, and what they exclude from their position of enunciation is precisely and simply sex. Why am I saying this? Now let me be very clear here, not to make fun of Me Too. My God, I think Me Too is a mega important moment maybe in the history of humanity. The very basic relationship between sexes, the basic matrix which began even in a pre-class society with the rise of tribal patriarchy is changing and so on. But I think that this type of approach just reproduces power structure, it's extremely dangerous and so on, and will end badly, especially for women. I think a different approach is necessary, where the first approach I would have made is not to paint, it would be even more subtly critical of masculinity. It's not out of any sympathy for men, I hope you would agree, to say that all those brutal rapists and so on, they are not really figures of power. They are really weakness who act out their impotence and so on. That's how I would approach the topic. And this is the problem we are making all the time, even generally. I'm sorry, some of you here were yesterday at my class, I will repeat my point there, of accusing right-wingers of being masculine, aggressive, strong, and so on, all these anti-immigrants and so on. I think, now this will sound crazy, I think we should adopt the opposite strategy. Maybe it's risky crazy, they will again proclaim me totally crazy. I will immediately finish. I plan to write a text praising Angela Merkel, against her enunciation, as you know, a weak, confused, womanly, soft. She is a true great German nationalist in a positive sense who believes in the greatness of German nation and so on. Why? Because, quite naively, is it a sign of great strength and trust into Germans that you are ready to say to immigrants, come here, we are not afraid of you. We will integrate you, we can afford it. And I think we should begin to attack anti-immigrant racists, not as strong authoritarian men who don't want to whip themselves all the time, but on the contrary, they are the true cowards. How can somebody who goes like Trump now into a panic if 300 immigrants are approaching the United States border? This is not strength, this is cowardly weakness. So, generally, I think that instead of just moaning, oh, power, but secretly manipulating our victim status precisely to get power, the true thing would be to grant power to others, but as an expression of my own sovereignty and power. A truly powerful man or woman has no need to terrorize, to be afraid of others, and so on and so on. And again, I think the same is with Me Too. Don't they get it that men also suffer today? This in no way justifies, I'm here fanatical, any mistreatment of women. But in today's capitalism, men are in crisis, and the only strategy is to make an alliance with, to somehow, I know it's difficult, it's almost utopian, to tell men, not, we are sick and tired of you posing as a strong male and so on, but to say, sorry, I don't buy your game. Of course, I'm afraid if you beat me. But at the same time, I am aware that you are a weak guy. You are the truly weak guy and so on. So don't be afraid of, instead of playing these disgusting games, I'm weak, and all the time, like in cartoons, you know, when a cat, an evil cat or who Donald there, whatever, sees money, click, click, you can see in his, before his eyes, those, you know, coins dropping balance. Instead of this, horrible, but you can see click, click, how can I use this? And I had some relations like this years ago to amuse me. I was very shocked. I was in a relationship with an American girl who was, well, exploiting me very much financially. Really, practically ruining me. And I complained, and you know what was her answer? How dare you say this? Do you know what men were doing for thousands of years to women, and so on and so on? You know, like this immediate reference to. So, what I'm saying is that, I hope you agree, I'm not criticizing in a very short way. I know, Me Too, because of making fun of it. I really want that some fundamental change will come out of it, and not just this same game of guilt and so on, who is more guilty, this pretty disgusting element of justifying your position only by making yourself more and more guilty. If you allow me to conclude another joke that I used yesterday.
You should be asking me.
Sorry?
You should be asking me.
I allow you. No, fuck them, you have the power.
Yeah.
No,
Okay,
if you allow me one joke that I used yesterday, I'm sorry to my students. Whenever somebody proclaims guilt and so on or whatever, there is always a hypocrisy in it. You should always ask the Lacanian question. When one humiliates himself too much, but what secret profit does he get? Usually it's a he, out of it. The joke that I told yesterday is one of those wonderful jokes from Jewish tradition, when on Sabbath in synagogue, Jews meet and first a rich rabbi said, I am nobody. Oh dear God, I'm not worthy of your attention, I'm nobody. Then a rich Jewish merchant says, I'm also nobody, God, I'm not worthy of blah, blah, blah. Then a poor Jew stands up and says, oh my God, I'm also a nobody. And the rich merchant kicks the rabbi. But who is this guy? He thinks he can also say he's just nobody or whatever. Not to be a nobody is a privilege. Didn't you? I had again and again this experience in the United States where are white people who are always ready, yes, we are guilty of everything. There are no buffaloes, not enough forests in the United States, Africa is starving, European imperialism is guilty of everything. But then I always notice their patronizing arrogance, how in their very denying of their identity, they reserve for themselves the position of universality. I see them all the time at round tables, interrupting others. Like, for example, it was so humiliating in Montana years ago, an Indian called himself an Indian. And the white guy interrupted him. Are you crazy? You're reproducing white cliches. You are a Native American, and so on and so on. You know, this is the object A. This is the surplus profit of this self-humiliation. Let's avoid this game. I was too long, I'm sorry, but that's my nature. Fuck you, what can you do?
Thank you very much. I was wondering how long it would take it to sort of go into Me Too.
You know,
It was worth it. It was worth it.
Don't overdo.
No. Actually, I was thinking that's precisely, part. I mean, I was thinking how would this work in practice, especially legally, but I think we acknowledged that, that's why a feminist hero is not necessarily Rose McGowan, but Stormy Daniels, who disavows the Me Too movement. Stormy Daniels.
But don't you agree? I'm much more sympathetic to that lady,
me too.
Asia Argento.
Well, yeah.
What was wrong? A beautiful lady. This would have been my dream when I'm 15, 16 years. A beautiful lady comes to you and makes love to you. Maybe I'm a primitive.
I think a lot of 17-year-olds. All right, now we have another half an hour or so. He wants to open it to the audience.
I don't care.
Because of time. No.
Do you want to respond to each other and then we open it to the audience, or shall we go straight?
I almost prefer not to. I will begin very briefly. I have many interesting things to say, like your Plato idea, no? You are right. You had wrong friends who criticize you for this. How important is, even in popular culture and cognitivism today, the idea of Plato's case, precisely like Metzinger and other intelligent cognitivists. They all the time claim Plato was right, he just forgot to include ourselves, that the way we experience our body, we perceive ourselves as part of the shadows on the game. So, not to mention, obviously, movies like Matrix, where I like it precisely the way you mention this problem, but we cannot go out of the cave. Because that's what the brothers, they are now both sisters, Wachowski, they show clearly, because at the end of, I hope you saw the movie, Matrix 1, the obvious question would have been, now that we saw we are manipulated by the Matrix, that for me most impressive scene, well, all those bodies are like in fetal position and energy drawn. Why doesn't he awaken there? Why don't they step out of the Matrix? No, he sees. We have to remain within it. Second, what you said about appearances. And now I connect to you, just a brief question. Where I agree with both of you, and would you agree to go even to the end? It's not, as you pointed out, Agon, very nicely, it's not just that late Marx go against this one, reality and its false religious appearance. Appearance is in reality inscribed into the structure of reality itself. What I would have added here is that up to a point, and that's the true subversiveness of late Marx, we can only even say that distinguish two types of appearances. Simple subjective appearances, the way things appear to me, and let's call it Marx uses the term objective illusion or whatever method, and appearance, false appearance, inscribed into reality itself. So what Marx is saying basically is, subjectively, you may even see things the way they really are. But objectively, in your social activity, you behave as if you're in the cave. So this idea that even if subjectively you don't live in appearances, objectively you are in appearance. The last question addressed to both of you. You know, there is a big problem for me, very simple one, with the relationship Marx-Hegel. There are, apart from simple dismissal of Hegel in mature Marx, isn't there a certain ambiguity in the Marxist relationship to Hegel? On the one hand, and this line was taken up later by young Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, Hegel's dialectical process, substantial unity, alienation of subject, and then in the liberating moment, subject reappropriates the alienated substance. This Hegelian process is taken over as the model of emancipation. For example, in the famous fragment on pre-capitalist modes of production, then with others, it's in Adorno mostly, in Marcuse and so on, dialectic as such, Hegelian, is logic of the capital. And the idea is that the revolution no longer follows the Hegelian logic of reversal, but Marcuse even, I forgot which one, he was popular when I was young, even wrote a short text claiming that capital is Hegelian. You know, this can be clearly shown how when Marx speaks in Capital describes the passage from money to capital, it's pure Hegel. Money as substantial universality to capital as self-moving. So that passage to emancipation is a break out of Hegel. Okay, the Stalinist question. How do you stand towards this? Sorry. It may be incredible, but I've finished. Thank you very much.
Do you want to respond?
Well, that's the maximal question, right? To connect that, because right now I'm cheating a little bit. I'm telling you in advance. To connect that to what the point you made about the Me Too movement, because if I understood it correctly, what you're basically saying is, where we have a level of explicit rules, right? There seems to be structural change, and there we're talking about structural weakness, victimization, and stuff like that, and the appropriation of the subjective position of the victim as demanding justice and so forth. But the implicit rule governing this explicit rules are the same as before, right? And hence, I mean, your point was always ideology is precisely the way in which implicit, and that would be a systematization actually, ideology situates between, right, it tells you how to apply the explicit rules and when make an exception, when reverse deep order, right? And so ideology is what connects the implicit to the explicit rules. In a certain sense, one could say, well, a similar, structurally similar problem you get with the Marxian appropriation of the Hegelian model, right? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, is it still the idea of we first have something like an alienated substance and afterwards the reappropriation? Precisely what happens in capital, and we just reverse the order, right? Because, I mean, if that were to be true, I mean, this is why you can say both, right? This is why you can say it is the logic of capital as automatic subject, as it were. But it's
Marx's term,
yes,
so that people get it. Marx is very mysteriously, this is crucial, uses this term, automatic subject.
Yes. But at the same time, it's supposed to be the model of emancipation, right? How can it be both? And in a certain sense, well, it must mean, and this is how I right now took your point, and that this must be, in a certain sense, the Hegelian Marxian understanding. Well, one needs a different relation of how to connect implicit and explicit rules, right? I mean, one needs a different understanding of ideology. I mean, that right, a different ideology, a different Yeah.
Just even a hint for some of you who are Lacanians here. You know, although I have big polemics with Miller, but at a certain point, in a certain passage, forgot, nobody interpreted this, but he made the same point when, you know, this eternal debate. Which of the four discourses, or it's another one, fifth one, is the discourse of a capitalist discourse? Is it hysteric? Is it inverted master? Blah, blah. And Miller proposed a wonderful, it goes to formula. It's the analyst discourse, just with terms functioning differently. Because isn't it clear that in capitalism, as in analyst discourse, object A is the agent and so on. Yeah. It is just, it's not the formula of discourse. It's again, these implicit rules of how it functions, you know. So.
Do you want to respond that?
No, I think I agree with him. I was just thinking of the way Althusser tried to differentiate his own dialectics from that of Hegel in the Four More. So he goes all the way. Like I think Beatrice Longinez has explained to three levels. So no, I think
you want to.
You know what I like about him? Just one point. That he comes from Kosovo, Pristina. And I caught myself, no, I'm not making this as a racist point, but to criticize my racism, how to really humiliate you, and I all the time think in racist terms, sorry, but I enjoy it, admit it. You know what would be the worst thing to tell you, admit it, is to address you in this patronizing way. Could you tell us, Agon, from your specific Kosovo perspective, you know? And what's so beautiful about him is that precisely when you read him and so on, you don't need this patronizing approach, which I get with many anti-racist academics who praise black authors in this racist way. The message implicit between the, you see, even if he is black, he is not totally stupid, you see, and so on, you know. But
you're not one of them.
But today, and this is the good point of globalization, I think. You really get one, I wrote a review of Jeremiah Slyke, a wonderful book on Haiti Revolution and its echo in art. You get black authors where you forget that they are black, not in this sense, white liberal. Oh my God, he is one of us, he's not even black. But like, this is the true way of overcoming racism, that you don't have to notice all the time, you know, his blackness and so on. So we forgive you that you are from.
We don't notice it until you mention it. Shall we open it to the audience now? Who would, there's
Please, I am sorry.
There.
Oh my God.
Do you need another one?
Okay. Do you have to throw it? No.
Oh my God.
There is
sorry.
such a
Yes.
thing. We should.
Is there a passage, or do we have to go out on the street? Oh no. Third row, yes.
Right, I want to mention three names of power. Machiavelli understood from his own historical context of being in the Renaissance that systems tends towards decrepitude, and further, also in his thesis of Hegel, makes an anthropological argument against Hegel as well. The issue of sexual consent, I mean, are you making a counter-argument against Hannah Arendt over her view that power is not owned by an individual but by the masses, and is therefore that individuals are given power by the masses? Is it therefore disingenuous to compare sexual consent to the Marxism of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie? And in sexual consent, is it simply an issue of vice versus virtue? Surely you should be making over the issue of consent to return to the argument of the common. And making an argument for the commons. In the commons. Commons, you know, like
the commons.
There's no that all the idea that the masses can rebel against the absolute power of the individual. So someone who returns to the tradition of the Enlightenment.
I must say, first, I don't want to break the rules. Should we answer as shortly as possible?
Yeah,
but
as shortly as
immediately, so
possible.
that we don't lose the thread. I'm not sure I followed exactly your argument, and I got it. It's critical towards me, but nonetheless, basically, if I got it correctly, I agree with you, because my approach, I don't know if we agree here, towards Me Too is precisely that. Its underlying anthropological, whatever position, is extremely individualist one. That it's strictly individual, you know, I interact with you, how to guarantee that, and so on and so on. I think that if we accept more this approach of the commons, we should also note one thing. I know that I will appear here incurably romantic, but you know, this obsession of some political people with power, the moment there is power, it cannot be really consensual and so on and so on. Well, I have here some paradoxical conclusions. The first one is, you may disagree with me here, but I insist. If by human rights we understand the basic equality, mutual respect, recognition, and so on, then I don't think that human rights and sexuality are ultimately compatible. Of course, they are in a general sense, like we should be against coercion and all that. But again, it gets so complex, because what if, you know, the problem with sexual relations is that everything that may appear as a foreign stain disturbing it, like elements of violence and so on, can also unfortunately work as a factor of sexualization. I don't believe in this, we take away our social positions, whatever, and we are just pure naked beings confronting each other and so on. Sexuality is terribly unjust, my God. You are a beautiful man or woman, and you attract all the attention, even if you are, and so on, and you cannot regulate this. You know who is for me here? I've written about it, the symptomatic point. You know them, they're the true madmen. A subdivision of American alt-right, so-called incels, involuntary celibataires. They are radical Trumpians against equality, hierarchy, and so on, except sexuality. They claim we are ugly, we don't get women, so their idea as free market Trumpeteers, Trump people, is some kind of a call, what even Peterson, my good friend Jordan, echoes in some sense, return to monogamy where some social institution, in direct, brutal way or not, should take care that every man, even a fat, ugly one, will get a woman. I think that the only solution here is that we have to accept the injustice of sex. I don't believe in, you believe. You out of Russia, where sex is most unjust if we believe our media. You know what I want to say is that the question of power, I think that, I know it's not my marriage, some marriages and so on, where, my God, there is a clear power difference. In some cases, man has more power. I know a couple of examples where woman has, and I'm sorry if I appear an incurable romantic here, but love enables them, at least for some time, to overcome this. Love does do miracles here, I claim. Because if you try to erase traces of power, then, my God, almost nobody can sleep with anybody else. What remains is only this kind of totally anonymous relations where you don't even know who the other is. I talk too much, I'm sorry.
I have a question. Where's the mic?
The mic.
Yeah.
And also, are there...
Thank you. I don't know much about Me Too, but You didn't mention the profit from this sadistic surplus. So there is masochistic surplus pleasure, but there is also sadistic surplus pleasure. And but at the same time, there is always expectation from the point of view of masochistic martyrs surplus pleasure that the monster will refuse to be a monster. And this you have in Verhoeven's film, A. So she's the victim, and she is expecting this monster all the time, but at the same time, knowing that she's the victim and getting this surplus pleasure from the victim, there is always this expectation that maybe this sadist will not use this surplus pleasure. And this is the point. So Me Too
But
is
why
ignoring
there is that he does not use it or that he will not use it?
He will not, he will refuse. The same is happening in Haneke's Pianist. So she is compelling him to produce all these sadistic things over her voluntary masochism, but clandestinely expecting that he will refuse this sadomasochist scenario.
Well, okay, I see your point. It's a very nice one. I'm more of a pessimist here, because you know, my basic rule with sadism, I follow here Lacan, is that a sadist does not objectify they are mostly meant his victim. Sadists are totally self-instrumentalized. A true sadist just brutally, as an instrument object, does his work.
I don't talk about true sadism, but someone...
I know, but the point what I wanted to make is that if it refers directly to our experience, let us mention that for Lacan, you know, what sadist enjoys in is not torturing or whatever the victim and the pain, but the moral disgust, split, shame that this produces in the victim. Paradoxically, a true sadist subjectivizes the victim. But in this perverted way, you know, you don't take it personally. I torture you, I see how embarrassed you are, and so on. You are ashamed of what is happening to me. That's what brings out my pleasure. And what I am saying is that, I'm sorry for this wild speculation. I couldn't do it, by God, you know who am I. Only once in my life did I hit a person, not really like this, not more. My son. He really annoyed me. I did one this, and the result was that not he. I started crying and apologizing. So, but nonetheless, I imagine myself. Everybody is allowed his dreams. If I were to be a true sadist, I would have noticed what you mentioned, and I will say, "Haha, I got her here. Let's see for how long I can torture here and she will stupidly expect this that I will, you know." I can easily imagine an intelligent, and they are not necessarily stupid sadist, counting on this secret hope, expectation, and using it to screw the victim even more. We should always, remember this, also against this idea of this pernicious.
Then comes the consent to be a martyr. Voluntary consent? Yes.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk too much.
We've got one more question here.
Why don't do it? Not really.
Two.
So I'm going to ask this question to Frank. So I'm going to raise it, Frank.
Are you another German colleague of you?
I wish it wasn't. No.
What, the German?
So I find your reading very, it strikes truth in the sense that when you say that the production of the shadows, so, okay, I'll send it differently. I would say that you talk of two kind of positions in this relation in the realm of the shadows or in the cave. So there are the prisoners on the one hand, and then there's the master who leads them out, let's say. So I like to now because it really show that there's a problem with Marx himself in the sense that the way he determines the working class or proletariat as it's kind of negative determination in the sense that it's a product of capitalist production itself. So, capitalism produces its own rate of this. in this sense. But then there's this problem of I would call it voluntarism in Marxism, the idea that if we define the classes only negatively, how can we expect them to actually act upon that, the historical mission? And I mean, from what I understood, it sounds as if you are, because you mentioned Sorel, and I was thinking of Gramsci actually, and I was thinking of the Modern Prince text, where it talks about precisely the necessity, but the experimental necessity. I mean, it's very Leninist in a nutshell. But who's the master in this kind of relation now? Like, if we take away working class as some sort of defining actor or subject of revolutionary struggle, who is the subject? But then, what kind of master would it be? Because I would say the master would be the party, and it was the tradition of the party, as the master who actually organizes the power of the people.
Yeah. I mean, just very, very quickly, 3 points. First one, recall that Hegel calls the science of logic a logic of shadows, right? I mean, that's, and it's about, yes, Schattenreich, yeah. And it's basically, the whole logic depicts, as megalomaniacally crazy this may sound, the creation of the new world, of a world. This is why Hegel says it's basically the thoughts of God while he created it, right? I mean, and this can only be done in shadows. That means on a level of abstraction, right? I mean, Hegel had this educational idea that in the beginning, like, children should paint like colorful pictures, but when they grow up, they should just like be forbidden colors, simply because thereby they learn to abstract, right, and see the concept and so forth. That is anecdotal. Second thing, well, someone already indicated, namely Alain Badiou, made allusions to these kind of, isn't this, I mean, he said that first when there was the financial crisis, and he basically said everyone is looking as if totally thrilled by it in a weird action movie, which is about us, but where we nonetheless the spectators, what the grade 5 or 6 or 7, right, that are about to save the world will do, Obama and Merkel and all them, right, which is a weird kind of position to put oneself in, right, this spectatorial position. But right now the true answer, and I mean it's a conceptual answer, but remember what Lenin says about the structure of the entire social sphere. He says they're basically masses. Masses are organized into classes. Classes are organized into parties, and parties are led by leaders, right? So right now, going purely for the masses, as for a long period of time, people who believe, for example, in the becoming conscious of the revolutionary class, right? I mean, if people just see how fucked it is and how dependent on themselves, then they will stand up and trash the thing. Never happened, right? I mean, at least not in this sense, and not fully successfully. So the masses reference seems to be problematic per se. It's what mobilizes, what populism mobilizes. The classes reference seems to be kind of hijacked, because if you look at Trump, I mean, it is a bit as if he's saying, well, look, there is class struggle, but, well, we won this time, right? So shut up. I'm not sure about going directly for the Revolutionary Party, but the leader thing seems to kind of work sometimes, right? I mean, and I'm not, that's not a joke, but a bit, I'm not saying that because I'm a German, right? I'm so sorry. But I mean, think about figures who, right, have mobilizing capacity. This is what I'm trying to say with the master, right? And the Leninist term for that is the leader. And I mean, you find analysis, Slavoj has done this endlessly, in what Hegel says about the monarch and the function of the monarch, right, in the state. I mean, this is the kind of, I think, mobilizing function that I would see. But what I wanted to add to that is that one nonetheless needs the volunteers, right, a different kind of volunteering, right, and because it's not, yes. Was that an answer?
But you put this very nicely when he said that precisely as free in the very Platonic way, precisely today in our consumerist society, as free individuals without a master, we are absolutely slaves. We need a master to step out of slavery.
Yes.
And again, we have to, there is, if you had a good teacher. You must have experienced it. By master, I don't mean somebody who knows better than you in this Stalinist way what you really want. A master simply opens up, makes you aware of the potentials in you. The true recognition of the master is, my God, only now do I know what I really want. And then, as you wrote nicely in this book, who knows? In the second stage then, maybe my Stalinist idea, what you do to the master, then of course not. But all I'm saying is that, and that's also the lesson of psychoanalysis, without what psychoanalysis calls transference. It has to come from outside. I don't believe in this pure self-reliance of the individual. You know, I talk only about this magic recognition. Through some external agency, you become aware of what you can do.
Doesn't that complicate, doesn't transference complicate the objective and structural relations to power? Because what you said today is sort of the continuation of what you did in the Marx related to Monica Lewinsky and Clinton. You know, there is a transference there, and so doesn't that complicate everything you've said about structural and objective power relations? You get what I'm saying?
Before you respond, can we also get another question there?
I'll take that one because that follows from that one goes back.
Just wanted to throw that in because...
First, when I was talking about structural relations, I didn't talk about, maybe to be very short this time really, I didn't talk about structural relations in an objective sense. I was talking about purely transferential, if you want, symbolic social space where, and this is what you were there, I think, maybe you heard it, what Milner meant. Somebody can be very rich in reality, structurally. It has great power over you. But structurally, he or she can claim, I'm the weaker point here. So again, maybe this would be the beginning of my answer. I agree with you that it's much more complex, but when I mention this relations of power and victimhood, my paradox, that's why I mentioned, and I agree, I'm now much more critical, Avital Ronell did crazy things. But nonetheless, basically, she is perceived as the master who disabused her power and so on. Although, if you look precisely the objective social position, she is the total loser, she lost everything, and that's what interests me, how somebody can be a total loser, but still she is the master, and so on. But I don't want to...
Okay, there's one more here and another at the back afterwards.
Well, I had to pick this up, and as someone who lives in Australia, I missed the contracts that we were talking about. It may have been that we were changing prime ministers, which you seem to do quite often, but it also may be that I come from Queensland. And to use a poor joke, seeing as you're able to do them, I guess where they look at it was in Tasmania that these contracts would exist within families rather than between families. But putting that aside and putting aside financial prostitution, are you saying that the sexual contract, if such a thing is drawn up, commoditizes sex, and if so, the other thing that I would say is that I come at this as an economist, not as a psychoanalyst. I failed to see whether the Labour theory of value exists within the sexual act, and if it does, where surplus value comes from. And I understand that reduces that all down to financial terms, but financial accumulation is, at the end of the day, what the logic of capital is about, rather than the other things. So I just wonder about your comments on that.
Very briefly. First, about Australia. No, I'm not saying now all Australia is talking about it, but I triple-checked it, that this exists as a law in New South Wales. I don't know how it is meant, I even don't know how to practice it and so on. And you know, I even know the detailed story, friends send me material. There was a famous judicial case, where I'm all on the side of the woman. Men claimed, but she consented. And the woman said, how do you know? I never said anything. And based on this, they try to solve the problem in this way. As for money and so on, no, I was not talking in sexual contract. It's not prostitution. Although prostitution is, for me, I'm generally opposed to it. But it's a very interesting phenomenon because in the sense that, you know what's for me the only, apart from horrors, the only attractive feature of prostitution, if you ask me, it's that, and I can understand, I consider this legitimate. What if you just want plain raw sex and you hate all the emotional entanglements and so on and so on? And it's something wonderful. Like if a lady says, why shouldn't she have the right to say it? I want to get properly banked. I hate all intersubjective relationships. So, and I can even earn some money and so on. There is a weird aspect of freedom in it. I think that where we should abandon this idiotic ideal that we always have to be, totally engaged authentically and so on. One should also learn to enjoy alienation. I want just this. That's why I find so oppressive this Me Too ideologists who focus on, women should not be objectified and so on and so on. I know very many women who are very strong as women. But when they want sex, their message is, please, I just want to be objectified.
That's not about prostitution. Prostitution is about market of perversions, which you can buy, but it's not about
yeah, but you also have, I know it's not about it, but don't underestimate this level. It's the same in psychoanalysis. Why Lacan insisted, apart from the fact that he was a greedy guy and so on, why Lacan insisted and psychoanalysts on money? Precisely, psychoanalysts' fear was that you get involved in certain libidinal game. And you have a triumphant example with Muriel Gardiner, the American very leftist psychoanalyst who worked with Freud. It's a wonderful old volume, it's not now reprinted, on Wolfman. You know what was Freud's big mistake in analysis of Wolfman? After October Revolution, Wolfman, from a rich Russian family, lost money, his family, and Freud, as a good guy, helped him. Continued the analysis, even gave him money. Predictably, the result was paranoia. Because, instead of having this neutral relation to your analyst as a distance, Wolfman started to ask, my God, what does he see in me? Does he want me to marry his daughter? What perverted game he is playing in it? So that it was later, typically, a woman analyst, Muriel Gardiner, who really cured him later in mid-20s only, and very successfully. He lived till early 50s in Vienna, an old guy, that would be wonderful. They're painting trees and so on, a painter. But what I'm trying to say here that when I talk about sexual contract, I know money doesn't enter in a direct way. But what Lacan tries to show is precisely, we can debate if it's justified or not, a parallel between surplus enjoyment and surplus value. And I think that precisely, as I indicated, in sexual interaction, there is always a surplus enjoyment, not in the vulgar New Age way of we had such intense sex, it was surplus orgasm, but precisely surplus enjoyment in the sense that something that may appear as an obstacle, like I don't just want to enjoy, I want to make the lady or the guy enjoy, I want to be a good instrument. You find enjoyment in precisely this, in subtle renunciation of your enjoyment. And at this level, I think, but I don't want to talk too long now, the parallel work.
One last question.
It's a slightly different question. I'm a great admirer of Slavoj's
But when you begin like this, you are sharpening your knife. Attack.
I'm a great admirer of your pyrotechnic use of dialectics and in the way that he demystifies the so-called self-inspection of the liberal world, and the way that it simulates to criticize itself and actually absorb itself. But by shifting a little bit onto the international geopolitical situation, which we're witnessing basically retrenchment of the liberal world in itself, in a way, and on the other, we have this binary, almost schizophrenic duality between the liberal, so-called liberal left that is, passionating itself about debates such as the one that you have been, dissipating so far, so eloquently, and a very brutal advance of basically a very brutal right-wing sort of brutalism, I would call it.
Yeah.
I think that we maybe should play the devil's advocate here and try to shift the look and our critique towards this impending tidal wave of fascism, which I believe in a way, through the Troy horse of so-called populism, is going to monopolize the public discourse in the so-called liberal West. And I would like to, if you could shed some couple of your
Maybe
thoughts on
we
this.
disagree here, but I see your
And
point.
sorry, and one last
I'm sorry,
point.
yes,
One
I'm
last
sorry.
point. Capitalism is obviously this, incredibly complex and fluctuating concept. Okay, and it's something that so far historically seems to have pretty much taken over everywhere. Sometimes we might think that something has really won when, in a moment of deep crisis, as it finds itself in many areas of the world, the only thing that everyone wants to do is to save it. So there is this big gulf, I think, between this incredibly effective critique of liberal thought and liberal hypocrisy and the risk that we are facing. We are ending up facing something immensely nastier.
I see your point. First, speaking about new capitalism and so on, just an empirical point. People are saying communism failed and so on. There is one case, I repeat it all the time, where communism triumphed, at least in the political sense, incredibly. Are we aware what is happening now in China? The leftists usually were afraid of two things. They had always two faces of the devil. On the one hand, white capitalist dynamic market exploitation. On the other hand, this control described by Foucault, surveiller, punir, control, manipulation, strong power. What China did is they combined the two. Worse, in a model, because are we aware that, forget about those triumphs of capitalism and so on, what the Chinese achieved in the last half a century is maybe unique even in the history of humanity. Such an explosive economic progress, and this is for me much more than our populism, if you ask me, the true devil that is emerging. Even Trump is in some sense part of this new authoritarian capitalism. Can I amuse you with a story? You know who told me this? Huang Weyer, who is our friend, the philosopher, leftist still. He told me that he met once Deng Xiaoping's daughter after Mao's death. And she told him a very mysterious, nice, horrible story. When Deng Xiaoping was dying, all the nomenclatura came to him to kiss his ass and ask him these narcissistic questions. Can you tell us what do you think is your greatest achievement? Expecting him to say it was the opening of China, and he said, no, my greatest achievement was this. When we opened up economy to capitalism, many of my colleagues, even maybe majority, it was not marginal, thought we should go all the way to democracy. I resisted that, and I think I was right. And my fear is that he was right. That because I Don't trust liberals who think, oh, what would have China achieved if it were opened itself up to democracy? No, maybe it would have been much more chaotic and so on. So what I'm saying is this. I agree with you. It is horror what is happening now. But nonetheless, we should ask a simple question. Where does this horror come from? It was the it's not evil guys like Joschka Fischer, the German expert, said everything was more or less okay, then as a meteor out of outer space, Trump came. No, Trump did not fall from outer space. If there is a guy who clearly emerged out of the immanent weaknesses of liberal democratic consensus, that's my only point. Of course, Trump is a nightmare, but the answer is not just criticizing Trump, but to learn from him. We should learn how to mobilize workers and so on, and especially, let's be frank, I will be very brutal. What can we, if we are still leftists, and I agree with you if you wanted to say with some social democratic sympathies. I'm tempted more and more to say this, that maybe the truly radical position today is good old honest social democracies. People often reproach Corbyn, Sanders, but they are just old-fashioned social democrats, where we live in strange times where maybe this is the only realistic subversive position. So ultimately, isn't there the true problem that also the so-called radical left, I don't think they really have not a detailed answer how to do it, but even a general vision, and the proof is its moralization. Moralization of politics is for me always an effect of so I agree with you, I don't play games here, and also my mocking support for Trump was not a perverse game. I'm very careful here. I would never tell anybody vote for Marine Le Pen, because hopefully United States are so divergent, complex, but France is so much centralized that to have Marine Le Pen in power in France, it's a totally different game. So I agree with you. My only point other would have been very briefly that, you should be careful when you talk fascism. I agree here with Alain Badiou, who draw the comparison that our position is more the one which preceded World War I. Like today, when people say you maybe follow the new rational optimists who say, where is the crisis? For the first time in the history of humanity, obesity is a greater problem than hunger. Look, relatively, we had one of the most peaceful periods in history. So they thought in 1990.
Capitalism is in crisis.
Sorry?
That's precisely why capitalism is in crisis, because there's been too long a peaceful,
That's the point. But it's not only capitalism. Yes, I agree. I agree totally with you, but beware. We are now talking, which is maybe much more dangerous, the situation before World War I. And I agree with your perverted, not your perverted, but object is perverted, criticism. And there is one difference. I will even agree here with you. Lenin, but Alain makes this point. Lenin was still able to say, okay, let's not be afraid of war. War will bring revolution. I doubt if such a war today would bring a revolution. I prefer not to think. And are we aware to what extent now the whole world is getting ready already for a new war? I told this to my class, I'm sorry to repeat myself. I read, Slovene friend, journalist, excellent, gave me transcription, Chinese military theoretical, only in Chinese, but not public, published a strategic text which is horrifying. They claim Russia and America have one advantage over us, Chinese. They all the time were engaged in small wars to test their army. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Chechnya. Sorry?
We're all disasters. There's nothing being.
Yeah, but the Chinese argument is, while our people's army is not tested, we need a war. That's pretty horrible.
Yeah, that is. I was hoping we'll finish on a more optimistic note. I mean, we did start. Actually, what the book does have back to and keeps repeating is the idea that 100 years ago, if 100 years ago, Rosa Luxemburg, the choice was between socialism and barbarism. Nowadays, we've got barbaric capitalism or capitalist barbarism, as you called it. Hopefully tonight we got different form of kind of barbarism, a la Žižek, Ruda and Hamza. And then we've got more ways of going forward. Sorry. Marxist barbarism as read by Žižek and Ruda and Hamza. So let's thank them for the alternative enlightenment.
Can I make just one final critical point? Are you responsible for it? Why is my stupid fucking name on the first place there?
That's true, that's wrong. It should be the other way around.
I know, I'm not kidding. I had a short text against object-oriented ontology, and I consider it modest. I don't deserve it. I'm saying without any hypocrisy and so on. This was hypocritical from you. Thank you.